Hello, hello, my friends. AmyR here with Prairie Paper and Ink. Welcome back to my face and my card making space. And my card for this week's Color Throwdown Challenge, which I will have linked in my blog post that's linked below the video. For those that are new or unaware, it's just a weekly challenge. It's open to everyone and it's just for fun. And it gets us thinking outside the box when it comes to color combos and combining colors that I, more often than not, just don't think of. So, yeah, I did some mucking around, really. That's what it was, literally, when you see it, with my Distress Oxide inks and Distress inks and sprays and Distress paint too. I used all the Distress things, really, making these cards. And everything I use, like oldie but goodie stamp sets, a newer-ish stencil. That's about it. So, if you keep watching, I'll show you guys how I made this card, and as well as the link to the challenge, which will be in my blog post. I always have supplies. Everything that I use is always listed and linked in the description box below the video, and they're all affiliate links. All that means is if you use any of my links and then you place an order, I get a little kickback for that at no cost to you guys, and it just helps me pay the bills, keeps my little heater, my garage heater running, and which is, the minute I set it, it starts to kick in. And my other little heater keeps the heaters going so I don't freeze. So, keep watching. I'll show you guys how I made today's card. So one of the oldie but goodie sets I'm using is the Simon Says Stamp Blissful Bouquet stamp set. This came out a couple years ago, I think. Yeah, last year? Something. I'm pretty sure I've done a video on this one. In fact, I know I have. And I chose this floral the last time as well. Because there's two big florals and then little like leaves and little clusters and different things. But anywho, I've got some Distress watercolor paper and I use my anti-static powder tool on it. And then I'm going to stamp this floral with clear embossing ink. And I'm going to ink it up and stamp it a couple times because for the most part, you can't see it even when you tilt it in light. So I just want to make sure I've got a good stamped image. And then I'm just flipping this around and stamping it again because there's enough space to stamp two of these on here. And then once I've got them stamped, I'm going to use Simon's Cream embossing powder. So coat that with the embossing powder, tap off the excess, and then I'm going to melt this with my heat tool. And make sure everything is smooth and melted. And like I always do, you turn it kind of back and forth in the light. If there's any like dull, green areas, they're just spots that haven't been melted yet. So I'm going to get all of this melted. And then I'm also going to stamp a couple of the different leaf images from this set, again, onto Distress watercolor paper and heat emboss those as well. So I always apply my anti-static powder. You see me, like I pulled the cardstock out of my MISTI. This is just so I don't get a whole bunch of that anti-static powder all over my grip mat that I have in my MISTI. So it just means I have to wipe off my grip mat like less often because it does lose its stick over time because, anti-static powder, dust, etc., etc. And to clean it, I just wipe it. Wipe it with baby white. You clean it. They're photopolymer, just like high quality photopolymer stamps. So you clean them like you would clean your stamps. And when they're really gunked up, I just wash them with water and a tiny little bit of like a gentle soap, like dish soap, whatever. And then you let it air dry and it's good to go. So, and just as a reminder, with the photopolymer grip mats, regardless of which brand, you don't want to let them soak and you don't want to use alcohol on them, like rubbing alcohol, etc. Just a stamp cleaner or water, baby wipe, little gentle soap. That's all you need, and it's good. So I did all of that, and then I took Saltwater Taffy Distress Oxide ink and a blending brush, and applied this. And I was being lazy when I did this, and I didn't really wipe off my brush, and I had a lot of pink in that brush. Not the end of the world. It created a really pretty color, but it wasn't really what I was going for. But in the end, I just went with it. I was like, whatever. I think I had a bunch of like picked raspberry or something like deep in that brush. And I've talked about this before. I don't wash my brushes. I'll wipe off my grip mats, things like that. I wash my stencils. There's certain things I do clean, but blending brushes, never. So serves me right. But again, not the end of the world. So I applied it, sprayed with water. This is going to be messy. I'm okay with this. That's what I was going for. And then sped up some of the drying with my heat tool because, as always, I'm impatient. You can let things air dry. And then I used one of my microfiber cloths. Make sure you're using a clean part of the cloth because mine, again, have tons of ink on them because that's how I clean my brushes. I just rub them on a microfiber cloth, go on about my day. But anyway, rubbing it over the images after everything was dry, it just removes any of the ink that's sitting on top of that embossing because Oxide, just distress oxide inks have pigments in them, and they do. And you can see it here too, how the embossing, it's picking up like all of the green, which is bundled sage. And I'm doing the exact same thing, using a little blending brush, just applying it. You can even apply like direct to paper with the ink pad, like skip brushes, etc., and spray it with water. And then let it air dry, or, you know, I speed it up with my heat tool because I'm impatient. And you could leave it here. You know, this is simple and easy and doesn't require anything, you know, any skill or anything, really. And especially if you're intimidated by like the messy watercolor look, which I personally just love, but it's a little bit to get into. This is a great way because, you know, it's messy. You know, it's gone outside the lines. I love it. But the nice thing too is if you do things like this, and it doesn't have to be with oxide inks, you could use distress inks. Any water reactive ink will work. But having that like kind of first layer down and it be messy and outside the lines, it just removes a lot of the stress, you know, that sometimes we build up in our heads when it comes to coloring and watercoloring and everything else. It's like, it's already messy. What's the worst that can happen, you know? So like I said, you could leave it and just die cut it and everything. But I had this like idea in my head of what I wanted. And so I kept mucking around with it. I'm still happy with how it turned out. But yeah, I decided to use my oxide inks. I pressed it just right onto my work surface. And I'm just using my little water brush. And I am painting in all of these petals. Still keeping it very simple. Not worrying about it. And I, again, could leave it at this point. But I was still wanting to mess around with it. So then I pulled out Saltwater Taffy Distress Ink. And this gave me a bit more intensity, which was what I was wanting. I wanted these to be a bit more intense. That's just, I go in heavy-handed with all the things. That's just what I do. So I painted the distress ink, and distress inks generally will soak immediately into your watercolor paper, etc. But because I'm applying this on top of like multiple layers of oxide inks, this is also kind of sitting on top of it, which is why it's a little more intense. And yeah, I was happy with this. So went along with just my little water brush and just added in this color. And I'm sticking to just the one color because this is for the color throwdown challenge. And that's another reason why I like it, because sometimes like limiting myself to colors, that just removes the what ifs. Because more often than not, I'm like, ooh, how many colors can I stick on this one image? Which is also fun. But sometimes it's like you can just get way too hung up on, you know, all the options. So I did the Saltwater Taffy, and then I took just a little bit of Rusty Hinge Distress Ink and painted that onto the flower centers. And then for the greenery, I decided to skip doing any painting with the Bundled Sage Distress Oxide Ink and went straight in with just Bundled Sage Distress Ink. And same thing, I just adding it immediately, I was like, oh, yep, like that. It just punched it up another notch. So same thing, I smushed the ink pad directly onto my glass mat, and then I'm just picking up the color with my little water brush. You could also use regular paint brushes for this, just little watercolor brushes, that'll work too. I just tend to, when I'm using distress products, I tend to use my little water brush. It's just habit at this point. I don't know. It works. So painted all of the greenery, and then let everything dry, because it needs to be dry before you do any die cutting. Mostly because like I use, you know, washi tape, different things to tape down my dies. And if your cardstock is still wet at all, a lot of times the pressure of the die cut machine, when it's like pressing the die and then the tape into the cardstock, if the cardstock is still has any moisture, it will tear, and not a good time. So let everything fully dry. And then I'm going to use the coordinating wafer dies to die cut these images. And yeah, tape them into place with just little bits of washi tape. That people were asking about that Tonic Craft Perfect die tape that I've shown in a couple videos. I still like that stuff. I tend to hoard things like that. And I have so many rolls of washi tape that I need to use up. I've mentioned this before. Washi tape does have a shelf life. It does become dry and brittle over time. It usually takes a few years. But yeah, I have got a stack of washi tape that I've had for years. So I'm just using it up for things like this. It works. So die cut all of my images with the coordinating wafer dies. And then I decided I wanted to play around some more. So I've got some just distress heavy stock. This is the cream heavy stock. And I'm using the Heart Blooms Stencil and that Bundled Sage Distress Oxide ink. And I didn't use my grip mat. I was talking about grip mats earlier. Didn't use it for this. It was piled up under like a bunch of other things, and I was feeling lazy and didn't want to pull it out. So I was like, I can just hold the stencil in place. Honestly, this reminded me of why I love my grip mat so much. I was like, man, how did we do this in the ancient times? Which has been a year since the grip mats and all the sticky mats have come onto the market. Game changer. I hate holding stencils in place. And yes, you can tape them too. Same thing. I don't like doing that. It's so much easier sticking everything on a grip mat. And you can't really tell like from the footage here, but like I was pressing pretty hard to hold that in place. And I was like, yeah, no, not going to do this again without a grip mat. And I mean, as in like after this video, because I'm going to stencil more later. And I still didn't bother pulling out my grip mat. We'll get to that. Anyway, did the Distress Bundled Sage Oxide ink, and then I put the background into my splat box, and I started with Bundled Sage Distress Oxide spray, which you got to shake up really, really well before you use it, because again, oxides have the pigments in them. So the sprays, the pigments settle to the bottom, so you got to shake them up. And then I also used Bundled Sage spray stain, just for different look. And with the spray stain, I only pressed the nozzle down about halfway. That's how I got those big splotchy bits, just to create texture. So I did that, let that dry, and then I pulled out a scrap of vellum, and I'm going to stamp that one leaf image onto it. So I used my anti-static powder tool on that, and then stamp that leaf image with clear embossing ink, and then I'm going to heat emboss that with that same cream embossing powder. So get that on there, tap off the excess, and then I'll melt that with my heat tool. And with vellum, you got to pay attention because embossing powder melts much quicker on vellum than on anything else. It's just the nature of vellum because it's so thin. So melts in a second. And then I die cut those with the coordinating wafer die. And then for my sentiment, I'm using the Elegantly Modern stamp set. And I don't have a link for this cardstock I'm using. I had this in my stash. I'm pretty sure this was Simon's Olive cardstock, which was discontinued years ago. I've got a few sheets of it left. I'm really sad. And I still haven't found any color close to it from any brand. Which, again, makes me sad. It just, FOMO, really. But anyway, the color was, like, really good to go with this color combo. So I used my anti-static powder tool, stamped the sentiments with clear embossing ink, coated them with that cream embossing powder. Going to melt that with my heat tool. And then once the sentiments are melted, give it a couple seconds to cool off. And then I'm just going to use my microfiber cloth again, making sure I'm using a clean section of the cloth to wipe away that excess anti-static powder. And then I'm going to use the coordinating wafer die for the birthday word. Again, tape that into place. And then for the little sentiment that goes with it, I'm going to use one of Simon's sentiment label wafer dies to get that lined up, tape down. And then off camera, I also die cut more of the birthday word from scraps of that same cardstock. And then for the inside of the card, I just used a piece of Simon's ivory cardstock. And this time I'm using the Bundled Sage Distress ink. I've talked about this before. If I'm doing something like this where it's like an all over pattern, or if I'm going to stamp a bunch, etc., I try to avoid using Oxide inks on the insides of my cards, because I just find that depending on how much of the Oxide ink is there, because it sits on top of the cardstock, it makes it a little hard sometimes, depending on the type of pen you're using, to write over it, because those pigments are sitting on top of the cardstock, and it gets annoying. So that's the reason, there's always a method to the madness. So I just used a blending brush and blended that bundled sage distress ink, and again used a fairly light hand. So I'll still get the pattern and everything on the inside of the card, but I can still write over this with like a black pen, etc. And then I trimmed that down, and I trimmed my textured background down with my guillotine trimmer so that these panels end up being like 3 3/4 by 5. And another thing I end up changing up a little bit later is my card base. Right now I'm using, I think this is Concord 9th Grapefruit, I think. Because this color goes really nicely with Saltwater Taffy. But now you can really see just how pink these florals ended up turning out. Like more pinky peach than like peach. Which again is fine. But it was bugging me. I was like, oh, this cardstock is not going with these cards. So I'm going to change that. But I'm using my card base just as a visual guide because I'm adhering all these pieces and I want them kind of hanging over the edges of my textured background, but I don't want them to hang over the edge of the actual card base. So I'm just using that as my like little visual guide while I adhere all the different things into place. And I'm using a combination of just craft tacky glue and then some thin foam squares to pop up the big florals so that I get everything arranged the way I want it and then get those, put into place. And then I took another piece of that. I'm going to do splatter first. So I took a piece of just scrap grid paper and I fold it in half and I die cut it with that leaf wafer die just to get 2 little die cuts. I'm going to use these to literally mask off just the vellum leaves. I've talked about this before. When I'm doing splatter, I try to avoid doing any sort of splatter on vellum because again, vellum is finicky. I love vellum. I use it all the time, but sometimes splatter is fine on it. Other times it just either won't dry or it takes forever to dry and I end up smearing it. So I was like, I'm just going to save myself the aggravation, mask them off, and then I don't have to worry about it. So that's what I did. So I just like tucked those little paper masks over the vellum leaves. And then I'm using Saltwater Taffy Distress Paint and put some onto my palette and then added a bit of water to just thin it down a little bit. And then my little fan brush and my splat box and splattered this all over this card front. And then once I was happy with the amount of splatter I had on here, immediately cleaned up my brush. Distress paint does dry permanently. You don't want to leave it in your brushes, etc. Like clean them immediately. So I just swirl them in a jar of water and then remove my little masks and let that dry. And then I took a piece of that same green cardstock and it was trimmed to just slightly larger, like 1/8 of an inch bigger than my distressed background panel. And I'm using my Tonic and Tim Holtz thread cutter paper distresser tool, which I haven't used in a bit. It's been a while since I, was doing my little mixed media kick and roughing up the edges of like every single card I did. So pulled that out and used that to rough up the edges. You can also use the sides of your scissors if you're careful. I've shown that in other videos. You can technically use your fingernails. I don't recommend it. Not just because I actually like paint my nails now because I'm one of those girlies, but it's actually like, it puts stress on your fingernails, especially heavyweight cardstock. So this little tool is only a few bucks, and I've used this thing so much that like it's almost going dull. So anyway, roughed up those edges and then adhered those layers together. And then once I've got those adhered, I'm going to stack my sentiments, and I just put magnets. These are the magnets that I got with my Glassboard Studio glassboard that I work on. So the magnets just hold the card front down. That was a trick I picked up from Yana Smakula. She is brilliant. So brilliant. Not just the tips and tricks, the cards she makes. Oh, I can sit and watch her videos all day, every day. I love Yana. So talented. Anyway, I switched cardstocks. I now have this like pink cardstock. And sorry, again, I don't have a link for this pink cardstock. It was in my stash and it just happened to go nicely with this color combo. So I made that into my card base, and it's a top folding A2 note cards of 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. So got the inside adhered to it, got the card front adhered, adhering the big die cut sentiment, and then adhering the little wishes for you sentiment under it. Got all of that adhered into place. And then as my final little embellishment, this is the final thing I don't have a link for. Apologies. I couldn't resist using them though. These are the Trinity stamps. Fortune Teller Flat Back Bead Mix. They're just pretty. They're pretty. They're subtle. But I'll add a link to the Trinity Pearl Perfection mix, which are just really pretty, like cream color iridescent, like pearl embellishments. Because I was going to use those. And then I found these fortune teller ones in my stash. And I was like, oh yeah, no, I'm going to use these. So anywho, got those adhered into place. And that finished off this card. So barring just those couple items that don't exist anymore, I will have links to all the things in the description box below the video, as well as a link to my blog post. And in the blog post, it'll be picture links and a link to the Color Throwdown Challenge. So anyone who is interested can just check out all of that info in the description box below. Thank you all so very much for taking the time to watch my videos, for thumbs upping, commenting, subscribe if you haven't. I would love to have you. And I'll see you all very soon in the next video. Bye.